really struck me when I came across it. If I know your soul, I can paint your eyes. And it's a very sad story attached to it because Modigliani died young, and the woman he wrote this quote, he stated this to, which was his wife, died shortly after through suicide. So it's about grief, but it's also about connection, and it's about the loss that grief is attached to, and the possibility of that loss being quite traumatic and combining with elements of trauma, clinically speaking, PTSD, dissociation, and depression, and sometimes lead to suicide. And of course, immunologists would say that it can also lead to the onset of autoimmune diseases or cancers. People in grief, partners in grief for about a year or two after the death of their partner, of their significant other, can develop cancer and have an increased incidence of autoimmune conditions or other physical conditions that lead to premature death. So a while back, it struck me that a lot of grief that I was coming across, or a lot of depression that was sent to me, was a combination of loss that had become quite traumatic and had become fixated or blocked and not really processed, and the movement towards depression came from the loss of meaning and the loss of connection. So, of course, I live in Australia. I am from Romania originally. I've been in Australia for more than 20 years. I've been a psychiatrist for 20 years. And I do a fair bit of psychotherapy with trauma-related conditions and medical legal assessments of institutional abuse sometimes and historical abuse cases. So there is the sacred that someone mentioned, I think just before in the talk, not the previous one, the one before, there is that sacredness of space that in Australia is very significant, and it's connected with the original inhabitants, the Aborigines, and they lost their culture, they lost their identity. So such a cultural loss is very traumatic and is very hidden in many ways. But they still value the beauty, the world, the nature. And that's where these are my photos. And one is from a beautiful place called Carnarvon Gorge in the middle of Queensland. And the other one is from the Western Australia wildflowers. So there is the sacred, the symbolic, and the visible. So when we talk about grief and loss, I think it's not only the visible, it's also the symbolic, and then it's also the cultural and sometimes the sacred when it goes to such immense losses. So be prepared to see some beauty because I know it's the end of a day and it's been a hard day. So I put some photos that are dear to me from the wildflowers. And from nature, from the national parks here. So we do inhabit a world full of beauty and uncertainty. And I think now we are very much in a space of uncertainty where beauty still exists, but with the COVID, there is an increase in fear and an increase in loss and in fear of loss. But also, someone was asking if COVID will bring more post-traumatic stress disorders. And I think there is the real loss of people who die with COVID in isolation in hospitals, which is, I think, enormous and very hard to bear. And to not be able to be next to the person who dies to not be assisting that process. So there is a form of real traumatic loss attached to COVID, apart from the anxiety that the whole uncertainty is bringing, because we are raised in a culture focused, unfortunately, primarily on fear and danger, and which creates this illusion of certainty. So I think life is about loss from the beginning to the end, and there is loss and there is grief. There is the experience of loss, and then there is recognized loss with the mourning that is encouraged culturally, or loss that is denied or disenfranchised or difficult because it's either internal or it involves situations that are stigmatized or not really validated by society. And I'm talking murder, suicides, loss of death of people who have affairs and secret lovers, or children who are not recognized, and so forth. So there is trauma, and the trauma breaks the trust, impedes the trust, and then there is injury, which can affect all the levels of our being. The physical is probably the one that is the easiest to recognize and to grieve for and to mourn for. But then there is the emotional, which in some cultures is even hard to articulate. There is the interpersonal, and there is the cultural loss. And I would say I just put on the left side the losses that obviously we meet in therapy with people. There's the loss of care when children lose their parents or they're adopted out. There's the loss of nature if the parents are unable to nurture and unable to connect and to bond, or in situations of abuse. It's even more so the loss of safety in so many situations that are either cultural, social, familial, or individual. The loss of ideals, it's even harder to touch on, but I think it's ubiquitous. And there is this longing for something that ultimately society does not fully provide for, and the self has to adapt to. The loss of hope and of connection. There's the loss of self that occurs in traumatic situations. And then the integration of different layers of the self is lost through dissociation and trauma-related processes, adaptive processes. There is the loss of integrity when people are forced or have to or decide to make compromises in their life. And I've come across all of those losses. So in working with patients, I always come across loss, come across grief, and come across trauma. But trauma is I think, in the diagnostic categorization, it's been attached mostly to just identifiable traumatic events, and then gradually we have become aware that it's not only how severe the trauma is, but what it means to the individual. And I would add to that the fragility of the self is equally leading to an experience of trauma in the face of injury that otherwise might seem minor, like betrayal or loss of trust or lies or insults or shaming, bullying, and so forth. So there is, of course, other types of losses, as I put there. And there is, I didn't put the traumatic grief, but it's very much the stages that Kubler-Ross identified for grief, we could easily apply to trauma. So there is an overlap. And in the traumatic grief, what I call traumatic grief primarily is a grief that is either connected to sudden death, I have it here, a death that is traumatic through suicide, through murder, through accidents, through natural catastrophes, sudden unexpected death, death of child, stillborn, disenfranchised, grief. And then you can look at the other aspects that are traumatic but less visible, like betrayal, exclusion, abandonment, secrets, lies, denial, and stigmatization, I would say. So there is that shaming and humiliation and bullying that can really affect a person who otherwise survives very significant traumatic incidents, because their self was formed around their sense of duty. And when the betrayal comes in, they are in shock. So they feel the loss more. And then obviously the loss, the grief, and the mourning are all parts of the process of acknowledging, experiencing, feeling, going through the process, and at times being enabled by culture to have some rituals for going through the grief, which I think is very useful and very meaningful, but not all cultures have it. And I would say that anxiety could be seen as a blocked anger and a loss of self, a loss of connection, and depression is also having elements of loss that are significant, loss of hope, despair, and search for new meaning. So the work with traumatic grief is a balancing act between focusing on loss and restoration, but denial, I think, becomes an impediment to adaptation and to healing the depression. And a lot of people with traumatic grief might come across as resistant depression. So the therapeutic alliance is the main element in enabling understanding of the soul, so that we can paint the eyes, and then we can relate to the person. And that's generating hope. It's leading to connection and neuroplasticity, shared understanding, and the reemergence of hope and curiosity, hopefully. So I like that quote as well. I only wish I had such eyes to be able to see nobody. And yes, so trauma is ubiquitous, so is beauty and the possibility of hope. And I will leave you with some beautiful images. And that's probably all I wanted to say. I can elaborate on a lot, but I think it's the